Thanks, Kat. We're moving on now to our woman from London/Massachusetts. Tanuja Desai Hidier is a writer and a singer-songwriter. She was born in the United States and raised in the United States, but now lives in London. Her first novel, Born Confused, follows Dimple Lala, the American-born only child of parents who immigrated from India during a formative summer after her junior year in high school. That is to say, it follows her during that formative summer. Her parents didn't immigrate after that formative summer. Quoting from the book's back cover, this is a story about finding yourself, finding your friends, finding love, and finding your culture, sometimes where you least expect it. Dimple is really a great character. She has a great sense of humor, a wry voice, and after 12 years, she's finally back in a second book, Bombay Blues. Tanuja, will you tell us more about this?
Yes. Can you hear me? So yes, the Born Confused is my first book, and the sequel, Bombay Blues, comes out next month. And I've also made 2 albums of original songs based on these books, which I call book tracks. And Bombay Spleen, which is the album of original songs based on Bombay Blues, is also out next month. The issues of setting are interesting and very vital ones to the telling of these stories for me, to the point that I'd say that the setting is a kind of character in each book. New York City for Born Confused, and Bombay, or a kind of, as she comes to call it, Dimple comes to call it, un-Bombay for Bombay Blues. Born Confused is set in New York City, where I lived for many years. Bombay Blues is set in Bombay, a city I didn't know very well until I embarked on this project, even though it's the city where my mother was born, my brother was born, where my parents met in medical school, and you know, the city of their courtship. For me, it was more a metropolis of myth and distant memory, but one that evoked a very strong sense of nostalgia, even though I'd never really known it. Interestingly, I wrote both books after moving to London, and with Born Confused, I was living on Portobello Road in West London. The next street up from where our flat was Lancaster Road, and that became Dimple's best friend Gwyn's street name in New Jersey in the book. And both of my book track albums were made with musical co-writers who live in London, New York, and Belgium. So thank God for, you know, the internet and all of that to help pull it together. So Born Confused is a South Asian American coming-of-age story that follows aspiring photographer Dimple Lala through summer that basically turns her world on its head as she tries to figure out how to bring her 2 cultures together. The title comes from ABCD, or American-Born Confused Desi, which is a term South Asians in South Asia have created for these second-generation kids who are supposedly confused about where they come from. With Born Confused, I was interested in exploring, in part, the idea of what happens when a subculture gains critical mass and momentum to become culture. And I wanted to pay homage to the thrilling Bhangra South Asian club scene in New York City that started to develop in those years, one that was inextricably linked to the amazing cultural moment in music coming out of the UK in '97, with the Asian underground, things like Anoka, State of Bengal, Talvin Singh, Asian Dub Foundation. At the same time, in the late '90s in New York City, South Asian Studies departments were forming, South Asian student associations, the South Asian Women's Creative Collective came into being, and in the space of one summer, I met more South Asians than I'd ever known in my life, up to all kinds of creative mischief. In New York, it was DJ Rekha's Basement Bhangra party, still going strong after 17 years, and her party called Mutiny, held at a place called The Cooler, that in many ways sparked the desire to tell the story of this cultural moment in New York. It was an eye and ear opening experience living it. And through Dimple, I wanted to take that C for confused in the ABCD moniker and change it to creative, as that felt, to me, American-born creative Desis, to more accurately reflect this scene and the Desis that peopled this world in New York, who I was meeting. I wanted to turn that neither here nor there space into a you are here, as Dimple herself learns that a hyphenated identity is also a whole identity. With Bombay Blues, it was a completely different story. I'd only lived in Bombay for about a year shortly after birth. I'd visited a few times in my childhood, stayed with my grandparents mostly. The city was a mystery, but it still somehow felt like a mystery that was in my blood, I mean quite literally, because of my family's connection to it. And with this book, I think I was really driven by a desire that was almost a duty, in a sense, to better know the city of my parents and try to forge my own connection to it. And though, of course, I wanted to explore culture and the idea of being brown among the brown, as well as place, and the cultural shifts happening within a globalized Bombay, as well as its many coexisting ancient aspects, even more than that, I wanted to move beyond questions of culture, or at least that kind of framework, and sort of step out of frame, enter a more ambiguous state, in part through Dimple's trajectory there as an artist and that of her heart. Dimple travels to Bombay to shoot the Browns, or so I thought when I began this book. But as I spent more time there, to my surprise and delight, blue began to overwhelm, initially in terms of actual sightings of that hue in Bombay, and then that hue became the clue to my book and led me to the idea of exploring the bigger blue, the blue of music, of mood, the wild blue yonder. It was a liberating and dizzying approach, exploring the city with a theoretical map that simply had a splash of color on it, and it required a kind of act of faith. With Born Confused, I had a much more mapped out outline. This one, there was a lot of winging it going on. And so like Dimple with her photography, my modus operandi, my unmapping map while writing this book became this, to follow a color all the way through and just see what that would lead to. In loosening the coordinates in this way, I also fell upon what became one of the main themes of the book, the idea that there is no place like home because home is not a place. It's a sense of sanctuary which you may find in a person, a place, a moment, a memory. It's a direction, really, more than a destination. And my own motherland had been redefined in a very literal sense. And the greatest challenges in writing Bombay Blues were having chosen to write a book set almost entirely in a city I barely knew, in a country I didn't live in, and at this point, as the mother of a small child and a baby, my elder daughter was 5 and my little one was 1 when I first began work on Bombay Blues, and my first trip to Bombay was soon after that for the book. So with Born Confused, I drew upon my years of living in New York, which was made easier to do once I was based in London writing it. In a way, Born Confused was an examination of the sort of answer I'd arrived at because of those experiences, and was an expression of a known, an owning of, an understanding of my own lived history. Bombay Blues was an entirely different process. Diving so fully into the unknown, it became part of me. Each of my 3 visits to Bombay for my book radically changed my story. Each moment spent, each person met, experience, conversation, significant silence even. And then came the magical turning point when the world of my book gained enough momentum that it seemed to be shaping the very city itself, art imitating life, imitating art to the point of no imitation, just realization. In Bombay Blues, Dimple is struggling to follow her heart and her art, to reconcile her known world with the unknown world she plunges into with her camera. Similarly, during the writing of it, more than trying to reconcile any physical places or cultural spaces, I was trying to reconcile motherhood with writerhood, freedom with often necessary constraints. And it turns out, with a frock of a lot of work, commitment, and ideally, crucially, an extra set of helping childcare hands, and very, very, very little sleep, they can be part and parcel of the same space. And just one more note on the topic of landscape and setting. Whereas with Born Confused, writing about New York was like making a record of a lived experience, interestingly and fittingly with Bombay Blues, it was more an experience of a land-escape than a landscape. Because in a way, the Bombay that I was looking for and that I'd been working, so hard for 3 years to find my connection to, slipped my fingers the moment I had fully written about it. or rather, the Bombay I was looking for turned out to be the Bombay in my book, returning that metropolis in a way to being a mythical city, a city of memory, from mapping it out to unmapping it, which brought me full circle back to the very point I'd started from. So with Born Confused, I explored a kind of answer I'd arrived at about cross-cultural identity. With Bombay Blues, I lived and still in a state of arriving at a question.
What surprised you most about Dimple as she evolved from book 1 to book 2?
That is a very interesting question. What surprised me most about Dimple? I think although she was somewhat adventurous in book 1, I think in book 2, her decision to have a very sort of physical and spontaneous experience of Bombay, in a way, surprised me. She's still quite an introspective, thinking character, but quite early on in the book, she decides to, get her hands dirty, and she's been at college for a couple of years at university. She's kind of hit a standstill in her work and feels like everything is always being analyzed to death, and why does she have to read so much about what she wants to do? Why can't she just kind of go out there and do it? And I think her willingness to let go of a lot of those tools surprised me a bit. And again, I bring it back, as a writer, I bring it back a bit to motherhood, because I feel like that's a very physical experience. It's an exhilarating experience. It's completely exhausting. And you do have to learn to let go in a lot of ways. It's a funny tango, actually. You sort of need to learn to let go while holding on. Children are, these little creatures are huge creatures. They're incessantly demanding. They're constantly inspiring. They're very frustrating. They're very absorbing. And it's a heightening experience and a very humbling experience as well to become a parent. And I think that realizing that you really can't control everything. I mean, I think Dimple probably knew that before. I probably knew that before, but sometimes you really can't control anything when you've got little people in the house. I think that worked its way into Dimple's story, like from my experience as a mother to her experience in Bombay, and sort of just letting go and going with the flow and allowing herself to get lost, and in some cases not even trying to get found, just sort of having that experience of being lost and losing her coordinates. I think that was maybe the surprise.